Welcome back to Chilling Fireside Stories, where the crackling of the fire is only half as haunting as the tales we share. As the nights grow darker and the wind whistles through the trees, there's no better place to be than right here, with a spine-tingling story by the fire. Tonight we're going back to the late 1970s, to an ordinary house in a quiet North London suburb. A house that became the center of one of the most famous and controversial hauntings of the 20th century. This is the chilling true story of the Enfield Poltergeist, a tale of strange voices, flying furniture, and the unanswered question: was this family truly haunted? Settle in, grab your warm blanket, and join me by the fire as we unravel this eerie tale of mystery. It was 1977, and the Hodgson family, consisting of Peggy Hodgson, a single mother, and her 4 children, Margaret, Janet, Johnny, and Billy, were living in a modest council house in Enfield. They lived a relatively normal life until one August night when something strange began to unfold. Janet, the second oldest daughter, was just 11 years old when the first odd occurrence happened. That night, she and her younger brother were lying in bed trying to sleep, when they heard what they described as shuffling noises. At first, they assumed it was just the house settling, the kind of noise you ignore. But what happened next would be impossible to ignore. Furniture began to move on its own. A chest of drawers slowly slid across the room as if it had been pushed by an invisible force. Janet, terrified, shouted for her mother, who came rushing in. Peggy tried to push the chest back against the wall, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something, or someone, was holding it in place. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. It wasn't just the furniture. Objects around the house began flying across rooms. Toys would be thrown by an unseen force, and knocking sounds echoed through the house at all hours. The family couldn't explain what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something was in their home and it wasn't welcome. Peggy, being a practical woman, initially dismissed the incidents as tricks played by her children. But as the disturbances became more violent, she began to realize this was something far more sinister. Desperate for help, she reached out to her neighbors, the Nottinghams. Vic and Peggy Nottingham lived just across the street and had always been close to the Hodgsons. Vic, a burly man who wasn't easily scared, decided to investigate for himself. As soon as he stepped inside the house, the knocking began again. He searched every room, thinking it was some kind of prank, but there was no one in sight. Vic later said that the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching him. What could it be? By now, Peggy Hodgson knew she needed help beyond her neighbors. So she called the police. Yes, the police. Imagine that, calling the authorities not for a burglar or a disturbance, but for something paranormal. When the officers arrived, they were initially skeptical, as you might imagine. However, their skepticism was quickly replaced with shock when they too witnessed a chair move across the floor, entirely on its own. The police, having no explanation, left the house, leaving the family to fend for themselves. But the Hodgson family's story didn't end there. Peggy reached out to the press, hoping to bring attention to what was happening in her home. That's when the Daily Mirror sent a photographer to investigate. What he captured would go down in history. Photos of Janet seemingly levitating in midair, as if she had been thrown by an invisible force. The pictures were eerie and for some provided proof of paranormal activity. But even this wasn't enough. Peggy knew they needed real help, and that's when the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, got involved. 2 paranormal investigators, Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, took on the case. These were not just random ghost hunters. They were respected investigators in the paranormal field. Gross, in particular, became very involved in the case, staying with the family for extended periods and documenting every strange occurrence. Just when the family thought things couldn't get any stranger, something terrifying happened. One evening, Janet began speaking in a deep, gravelly voice. It wasn't her normal voice, and what she said chilled everyone to the bone. Janet claimed to be speaking for Bill, an old man who had once lived in the house. Through Janet, Bill described how he had died in the living room, sitting in a chair, something that the Hodgson family had no prior knowledge of. The voice continued to speak for days, often shouting profanities and terrifying the family. Gross and Playfair recorded hours of these disturbing conversations. The voice was analyzed by experts who confirmed that it was being produced by Janet. But how a young girl could maintain such a deep and sustained voice without damaging her vocal cords remained a mystery. Was Janet truly possessed by the spirit of this man? Or was she somehow faking the entire thing? What do you think, dear listener? Could a young girl create such an elaborate ruse? Or was this truly something paranormal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As the case gained more attention, so did the skepticism. Many people believed that Janet was faking the entire thing, that it was nothing more than a cry for attention. Some even accused the Hodgson family of fabricating the haunting in order to make money from the publicity. One particular incident involved Janet being caught bending spoons and hiding objects around the house, which fueled the skeptics' arguments. But despite these claims, Gross and Playfair remained convinced that at least some of the phenomena were genuine. Gross, in particular, had formed a close bond with the family and believed that Janet, whether consciously or unconsciously, was being manipulated by a force beyond her control. They recorded countless hours of audio and video evidence that they believed supported the existence of a poltergeist. Yet the skeptics persisted. Magicians like James Randi and experts in psychological phenomena argued that the entire case was nothing more than an elaborate hoax, a mix of psychological disturbance and teenage pranks. But how could they explain the police officers who had witnessed the activity, the photographer who captured the levitations, the eerie voices that came from Janet recorded for all to hear? Regardless of whether you believe the haunting was real or not, one thing is certain. The events took a devastating toll on the Hodgson family. Peggy was at her wits' end. She had 4 children to care for, and her home had become a battleground for something she couldn't understand. Janet, the center of the activity, was deeply affected. She later admitted that some of the incidents were exaggerated, but insisted that most of the events were completely out of her control. The haunting continued for over a year, with the family enduring sleepless nights, strange voices, and flying objects. The paranormal activity eventually began to subside in 1979, as suddenly as it had begun. But by then the damage was done. The Hodgson family's lives were changed forever. To this day, the Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most well-documented hauntings in history. There have been books written, documentaries made, and even a film based on the events. But the question remains, was it all real? Some believe that the family was genuinely haunted by a malevolent force, perhaps the spirit of Bill, or something far darker. Others maintain that it was all a hoax, a combination of teenage mischief and the desire for attention. We may never know the full truth, but one thing is certain. The story of the Enfield Poltergeist continues to captivate and terrify people around the world. As with any haunting, the events eventually subsided, but the impact they had on the family lasted a lifetime. After the poltergeist activity finally came to an end in 1979, the Hodgsons did their best to move on. But how do you move on from something that made headlines, attracted the world's attention, and left you living in constant fear for almost 2 years? For Peggy Hodgson, life returned to a quiet normalcy, but not without its scars. She continued to live in the Enfield house until her death in 2003, never fully escaping the strange events that had haunted her family. She always maintained that the paranormal activity was real, despite the skeptics. Janet, the center of the poltergeist phenomenon, grew up with a mixed legacy. As a child, she was reluctant to talk about the events publicly, perhaps due to the trauma and the intense media scrutiny. However, as she got older, Janet opened up more about the haunting. In interviews years later, she admitted that some of the activity might have been exaggerated, but she stood by her story that much of what happened was beyond her control. Janet moved away from Enfield, trying to leave behind the eerie memories of her childhood. She later married and had children of her own, although she shared that the paranormal activity had returned briefly when she was an adult, though not as intensely as before. She went on to live a relatively quiet life, but the memory of those strange events would never fully fade. Janet's brother Johnny, sadly passed away at a young age, and her younger brother Billy also passed away in his 50s. As for Margaret, Janet's older sister, she too largely avoided the public eye. She backed up her sister's claims about the haunting, saying that what they experienced as a family was both terrifying and real. Interestingly, the infamous house in Enfield has since passed on to new tenants, and reports indicate that no further paranormal activity has been reported since the Hodgson family left. Was the house haunted only during their time there? Or did something attach itself specifically to the Hodgson family? It's a mystery we may never fully solve. The legacy of the Enfield Poltergeist lives on, not just in books and films, but in the memories of those who lived through it. Whether you believe it was a true haunting or an elaborate hoax, the case remains one of the most well-documented paranormal occurrences of the modern era. And with that, dear listeners, we reach the end of another chilling fireside tale. But before you go, think about this. How would you react if these events happened to you? Could you live in the same house night after night knowing something unseen was with you? Would you believe it or would you doubt yourself? These questions may never have definitive answers, but they're the ones that keep us coming back to stories like these. If you enjoyed tonight's story and want to hear more about true crime, paranormal events, and unsolved mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay cozy, stay curious, and remember, some stories are never truly over.